Blood-red dust swirled across the empty street as Darcy Ellis stood before the town council of Val Verde, Texas, her chin held high despite the tears streaming down her face. The year was 1875, and the five stern-faced men seated at the weathered oak table had just delivered their verdict: banishment from the only home she'd ever known. "You've brought shame upon your family and this town," Mayor Holloway declared, his voice echoing through the hushed meeting hall. "Your indiscretions with the Comanche boy show a deplorable lack of moral character." Darcy's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "His name was Talon, and I loved him." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered townspeople. Even now, weeks after Talon's death at the hands of a trigger-happy Texas Ranger who claimed self-defense, Darcy refused to deny her feelings. The forbidden romance between a white shopkeeper's daughter and a Comanche man had scandalized Val Verde once discovered. That Talon had been educated at a government school, spoke perfect English, and worked as a translator made no difference to the town's prejudices. "You have until sundown tomorrow to leave Val Verde," Mayor Holloway continued. "After that, you'll be forcibly removed. The Ellis name meant something in this town before you tarnished it." Her father, standing in the back row, wouldn't meet her eyes. Her mother sobbed quietly into a handkerchief. Neither spoke in her defense. "I'll be gone by dawn," Darcy replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "But know this, I didn't bring shame to Val Verde. Val Verde brought shame to itself." With that, she turned on her heel and strode from the hall, the heavy doors slamming behind her with a finality that matched the closing of this chapter of her life. At 22, Darcy Ellis was about to face the wild frontier alone, banished for the crime of loving too deeply across boundaries others couldn't or wouldn't cross. She didn't notice the stranger watching from the shadow of the livery stable across the street, a tall cowboy leaning against his horse, hat pulled low over his eyes. But Samuel Ryder had noticed her, and what he'd witnessed stirred something in him that had long lain dormant. "Now there's a woman worth knowing," he murmured to his horse, a sturdy palomino that nickered softly in response. "Loving too deeply. That's exactly the kind I want." Dawn hadn't yet broken when Darcy led her mare from the small stable behind her parents' home. She'd packed light some clothes, her mother's silver hand mirror, a few treasured books, the money she'd saved working in her father's general store, and the beaded necklace Talon had given her, now hidden beneath her high-necked blouse. The air was crisp with early autumn chill as she secured her bedroll and provisions. She wore riding clothes, practical trousers hidden beneath a split skirt that allowed her to ride astride rather than side saddle. It was one of many conventions she'd abandoned over the years, much to her mother's dismay. "Going somewhere, Miss Ellis?" The deep voice startled her, and she whirled around, one hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver tucked at her waist. A tall man stood at the entrance to the stable, silhouetted against the faint pre-dawn light. "Who's asking?" she demanded, her voice taut with tension. He stepped forward, and the weak lantern light revealed his features. Tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin, he had the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. Dark hair curled beneath a well-worn Stetson, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, studied her with frank interest. "Samuel Ryder," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy. "I was at the meeting yesterday. Couldn't help overhearing your predicament." Darcy's eyes narrowed. "Come to gawk at the fallen woman of Val Verde before she rides into exile?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not exactly. I'm headed north to Colorado territory. Thought you might want company on the trail. It's dangerous country for a lone rider." "And why would you help me? You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I know you stood your ground against the entire town. I know you loved someone they said you shouldn't. And I know that takes more courage than most men I've met possess." Darcy studied him warily. Tall and lean, with a revolver holstered at his hip and the easy stance of a man comfortable with his own capabilities. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his boots of good quality though well used. "What's your business in Colorado?" she asked. "I've got land up near Durango." "Good grazing country." Been working cattle drives for 5 years to save up for my own place. Finally managed it last year. You're a long way from Durango, Samuel nodded. Had business in San Antonio, selling my herd and buying breeding stock. Was just passing through Val Verde when I caught your little showdown with the town council. Darcy hesitated. The idea of traveling alone through Indian territory and the lawless stretches of the frontier terrified her, though she'd never admit it. Still, trusting a stranger carried its own risks. I don't need charity, Mr. Ryder. Good, because I'm not offering any. What I am offering is mutual benefit. You get protection on the trail, and I get company more appealing than my horse. His eyes crinkled with good humor. No offense to Phoenix here, but his conversation skills are limited. Despite herself, Darcy felt a reluctant smile tug at her lips. And what do you know about me, other than my public disgrace? I know you're brave. I know you're determined. I know you're facing a hard journey with your head high instead of cowering. That tells me all I need to know about your character. He paused. The rest I hope to learn along the way. Darcy considered his words. There was something in his direct gaze that spoke of honesty, something in his manner that didn't suggest the predatory interest she'd seen in other men's eyes. I'm headed to my aunt's place in Denver, she said finally, if Durango's on your way. It's close enough, Samuel replied with a nod. I can see you safely to Denver. I can pay my own way, Darcy insisted, and I can shoot, I'm not helpless. Samuel's smile widened. I never thought you were, Miss Ellis. Shall we ride out before the town wakes? I'd rather avoid any unpleasantness. Darcy nodded, turning back to finish tightening her saddle. Give me 5 minutes. As promised, they were on the trail before the first residents of Val Verde stirred from their beds. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the horizon in bands of gold and pale blue. Darcy refused to look back as they crested the hill that would take Val Verde from view. Samuel respected her silence as they rode, maintaining a steady pace and keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. It wasn't until midday, when they stopped by a small creek to water the horses, that he spoke again. Your family didn't try to stop you leaving. He asked as he refilled his canteen. Darcy's jaw tightened. My father chose the town's respect over his daughter. My mother chose my father. It's a simple calculation. Nothing simple about turning your back on your own blood, Samuel observed. They didn't see it that way. They believe I turned my back on them first. Darcy knelt by the creek, splashing cool water on her face. By loving Talon, I rejected everything they valued, their standing in the community, their beliefs about who was worthy of love. Samuel watched her for a long moment. This Talon, he must have been quite a man. He was, Darcy said softly, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the beaded necklace hidden beneath her blouse. Educated, thoughtful, brave, he moved between two worlds with such grace. He taught me to see beyond the boundaries of Val Verde. What happened to him? Samuel asked, his voice gentle. Darcy closed her eyes briefly. A ranger shot him. Claimed Talon reached for a weapon. He had no weapon, just a book of poetry in his saddlebag. We were meeting in secret, planning to leave together. The ranger followed me, thinking I was in danger. Her voice turned bitter. He was given a commendation for saving me. Samuel remained silent for several moments, then said quietly, I'm sorry. Are you? Darcy challenged, her grief making her voice sharp. Most white men would say good riddance. I'm not most men, Samuel replied simply. I judge people by their actions, not their bloodlines, and I've known good and bad men of every color under the sun. Darcy studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was no artifice in his expression, no hint of the patronizing sympathy she'd come to expect. We should keep moving, she said finally, rising to her feet. I'd like to put more distance between us and Val Verde before nightfall. They traveled steadily through the afternoon, making good time across the rolling Texas landscape. Samuel proved to be an easy traveling companion, neither pressing Darcy for conversation nor leaving her feeling ignored. He pointed out landmarks, shared stories of his years on cattle drives, and demonstrated a dry wit that occasionally drew reluctant smiles from her. As the sun began its descent, Samuel guided them toward a stand of cottonwoods beside a small tributary. Good place to make camp, he explained. Water for the horses, firewood at hand, and those rocks will provide some shelter if the wind picks up. Darcy nodded, dismounting with a slight wince. Though she'd ridden often, a full day in the saddle had left her muscles protesting. "I'll see to the horses if you want to gather firewood," Samuel offered. "I can manage my own horse," Darcy replied, more sharply than she'd intended. Samuel held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Just trying to divide the work efficiently." "You're welcome to take care of your mare and I'll find the firewood." Embarrassed by her defensive reaction, Darcy nodded. "That's fine, thank you." As they settled into the campsite routine, Darcy found herself impressed by Samuel's efficiency. He built a small, well-contained fire that provided warmth with minimal smoke, produced coffee from his provisions, and set about preparing a simple meal of beans, bacon, and hardtack with practiced ease. "You've done this before," Darcy observed as he handed her a tin plate. Samuel chuckled. "More nights than I can count. 5 years on the trail teaches a man the importance of a decent camp setup." "Tell me about your ranch," Darcy said, surprising herself with the question. She hadn't meant to encourage personal conversation, but something about the gathering darkness and the isolation of their small fire made the inquiry feel natural. Samuel's face lit up with enthusiasm. "It's not much yet, a cabin, a small barn, about 300 acres along the Animas River. Good water, good grass, the mountains rise up behind it like they're guarding the place." His voice grew soft with pride. "The Ute called that valley the place where the earth touches the sky. When the sun sets behind those peaks, you'd swear they were right." "Sounds beautiful," Darcy murmured. "It is, harsh in winter but worth every frozen morning when spring comes. I've got plans to expand better fencing, a larger herd, maybe even a proper house someday." He glanced at her across the fire. "What about you? What will you do in Denver?" Darcy's shoulders tensed. "I haven't thought beyond getting there. My aunt runs a dressmaking shop. I suppose I'll help her while I figure things out." "You don't sound enthusiastic about dressmaking." "I'm not," Darcy admitted. "I've always preferred books to needlework. My father wanted me to take over the store's accounts before." She trailed off. "Before Talon," Samuel guessed. Darcy nodded. "I have a head for numbers. Father said it was unusual for a woman but useful for the business." Her mouth twisted bitterly. "Now he says my intelligence just made me more susceptible to dangerous ideas." Samuel studied her across the flames. "Like the idea that love doesn't follow neat boundary lines." "Like that," Darcy agreed quietly. "And the idea that a woman might choose her own path." "Sounds like you've got more courage than the entire town of Val Verde put together," Samuel observed, pouring her more coffee. Darcy accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. "Or just more foolishness." "There's a fine line between courage and foolishness," Samuel acknowledged with a slight smile. "Usually, you don't know which side you're on until after the fact." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as night fully descended, wrapping them in darkness relieved only by the dancing flames of their small fire. Distant coyotes began their nightly chorus, the haunting calls echoing across the prairie. "I'll take first watch," Samuel said, rising to his feet and checking his revolver. "You should get some rest." Darcy's eyebrows rose. "You think we need a watch?" "Probably not," Samuel admitted. "But I never sleep well the first night on the trail anyway. Old habits from cattle drive days." "Too many nights fending off rustlers or wolves." Darcy hesitated, then nodded. "Wake me in a few hours then. I'll take a turn." Samuel looked like he might protest, then thought better of it. "Fair enough." Darcy unrolled her bedding on the opposite side of the fire, her revolver placed carefully within reach. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive as her mind raced with memories of Val Verde, of Talon, of the uncertain future that awaited her. Across the fire, Samuel sat with his back against a rock, his profile illuminated by the flames, watchful and still. "Mr. Ryder," she said softly. "Samuel," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my given name." "Samuel," she amended. "Why are you really helping me?" He was quiet for so long that Darcy thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I watched my sister go through something similar, years ago. She fell in love with a Mexican vaquero on a neighboring ranch. Good man, hard worker, would have died for her, but our father couldn't see past his heritage." Samuel's voice grew tight. He sent her away to relatives in Boston. By the time I found her, 2 years later, she was married to a banker twice her age, with dead eyes and a spirit so broken I hardly recognized her. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. I promised myself I'd never stand by while someone else faced the same fate. When I saw you yesterday, standing tall against those small-minded fools, he shrugged. Let's just say I recognized courage when I saw it. Darcy absorbed his words, finding no deception in them. I'm sorry about your sister. So am I, Samuel replied softly. Get some sleep, Darcy. Tomorrow will be a long day. Surprisingly, sleep came more easily after that, and when Samuel woke her for her watch, she felt more rested than she'd expected. The night passed without incident, and they broke camp at first light, continuing their journey northward. Over the next several days, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Their days were filled with steady riding, interspersed with breaks to rest the horses and share simple meals. Their conversations grew easier, ranging from books they'd read to places they'd seen, from childhood memories to hopes for the future. Darcy found herself slowly relaxing in Samuel's company, drawn to his straightforward manner and quiet confidence. They skirted larger settlements, stopping only at isolated trading posts to replenish supplies. Samuel was careful to introduce Darcy as his sister when they encountered other travelers, a precaution against the assumptions that might be made about an unmarried man and woman traveling together. On the 6th night, camped in a sheltered canyon, a sudden thunderstorm caught them by surprise. The rain came down in torrents, quickly overflowing the small creek beside their camp and threatening to flood their position. We need higher ground. Samuel shouted over the roar of water and thunder, already gathering their belongings. There's a rocky outcrop about half a mile back. Darcy worked quickly alongside him, securing their provisions and saddling the nervous horses. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making every step treacherous as they led the animals up the steep trail to the outcrop Samuel had remembered. By the time they reached it, they were both drenched to the skin, but the natural overhang offered welcome shelter from the worst of the downpour. Samuel quickly set about creating a makeshift barrier of brush and canvas to block the driving rain, while Darcy tried to salvage what dry kindling remained in their packs. No chance of a fire tonight, Samuel observed grimly, water streaming from his hat as he removed it. Everything's soaked through, Darcy nodded, shivering as the wind cut through her wet clothing. The temperature's dropping fast. Samuel rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a wool blanket that had remained relatively dry in its oiled leather wrapping. Take this, he said, holding it out to her, and you'd better get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. Darcy hesitated, clutching the blanket. Turn around, she instructed. Samuel obliged without comment, busying himself with securing the horses while Darcy stripped off her sodden outer garments, leaving only her camisole and drawers. She quickly wrapped the blanket around herself, grateful for its warmth. Decent, she called, and Samuel turned back. He'd removed his wet shirt, revealing a torso mapped with scars, the legacy of years spent in a dangerous profession. Darcy tried not to stare as he spread their wet clothing over the rocks, hoping the worst of the moisture might drain away. You should get out of those wet trousers too, Darcy said, her practical nature overcoming her modesty. You're no good to either of us with pneumonia. Samuel's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, turning away again to strip down to his long underwear. The storm continued to rage outside their shelter, lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, stark flashes. We should try to share body heat, Samuel said matter-of-factly. It's only going to get colder. Darcy knew he was right, but still she hesitated. It had been months since she'd been this close to another person. Months since Talon's death had left her feeling like half a person. The thought of physical contact, even for practical reasons, made her heart race with anxiety. Samuel seemed to sense her discomfort. I give you my word as a gentleman that my intentions are honorable, he said softly. But if you'd rather not, no, you're right, Darcy interrupted. It's the sensible thing to do. They arranged themselves awkwardly at first, sitting side by side against the rock wall, the blanket wrapped around both their shoulders. Darcy held herself rigidly, trying to maintain a space between them despite the limited shelter. "This isn't going to work if you keep yourself wound tighter than a new watch spring," Samuel observed, his voice gentle. "I promise I don't bite." Despite herself, Darcy laughed a small, rusty sound. "I know, it's not you, it's just—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain. "You haven't been this close to anyone since Talon," Samuel guessed. His perception surprising her, Darcy nodded, not trusting her voice. "I understand," he said simply. "We'll go at your pace. But it's a cold night, and a little human warmth might make the difference between comfort and misery." Gradually, as the night wore on and the temperature continued to drop, Darcy found herself relaxing into Samuel's solid presence beside her. His arm around her shoulders offered steady warmth, and when she finally dozed off, her head came to rest naturally against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat a comforting backdrop to her dreams. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm having moved on during the night. Darcy woke to find herself still nestled against Samuel, his arm protective around her even in sleep. For a moment she remained still, surprised by how safe she felt. Then, remembering where they were and the circumstances of their closeness, she carefully extricated herself from his embrace. Samuel stirred, opening his eyes to find Darcy already gathering their still damp clothing. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "How did you rest?" "Better than I expected," Darcy admitted, keeping her back to him as she examined her riding clothes. "These are still damp, but they'll dry quickly once the sun's higher." Samuel rose, stretching his tall frame. "The creek will have risen with the rain. We should check the trail before attempting to move on." Their immediate surroundings had changed dramatically overnight. What had been a gentle creek was now a rushing torrent, and parts of the trail they'd used had washed away completely. After a careful survey, Samuel shook his head. "We need to wait for the water to recede. Trying to cross now would be foolhardy." Darcy nodded her agreement, resigned to the delay. They spent the morning drying their belongings and taking inventory of their supplies. By midday, the sun had dried their clothing, and they were able to dress properly again. "Tell me more about your aunt in Denver," Samuel said as they shared a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack. "Is she expecting you?" "I sent a letter before leaving Val Verde," Darcy replied. "Whether she received it yet, I can't say. Aunt Margaret is my mother's older sister. She left Texas 20 years ago after her husband died, scandalized the family by starting her own business instead of remarrying." "Sounds like independence runs in the family," Samuel observed with a smile. Darcy returned the smile, surprising herself. "I suppose it does. Aunt Margaret wrote to me often when I was growing up, sending books and encouraging my education. Mother always said she had unusual ideas, but I found her fascinating." "And you think she'll welcome you?" "I hope so," Darcy said, her smile fading. "She's the only family I have now who might understand my situation." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Family isn't always blood," he said finally. "Sometimes it's the people who accept you for who you are, not who they want you to be." Darcy considered his words. "Is that why you live alone on your ranch? Your family didn't accept who you are?" "Partly," Samuel acknowledged. "After what happened with my sister, my father and I had a falling out. He wanted me to join the family banking business in St. Louis. I wanted open skies and my own place. We haven't spoken in 8 years." "Do you regret it?" Darcy asked softly. Samuel's gaze turned distant. "I regret the breach, but not the choice. A man has to live his own life, not the one others map out for him." His eyes refocused on her. "Just like a woman should be free to love where her heart leads." The intensity of his gaze made Darcy's pulse quicken, and she looked away, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of their conversation. "The water seems to be receding," she observed, changing the subject. "Do you think we'll be able to move on tomorrow?" Samuel allowed the diversion. "If the weather holds, yes. We'll need to adjust our route, but we should be able to make up lost time." By the following morning, the floodwaters had indeed receded enough for them to continue their journey. They made good progress over the next several days, crossing into Indian territory and traveling through the rugged landscape with cautious efficiency. Darcy found herself increasingly comfortable in Samuel's company, drawn to his quiet strength and unpretentious intelligence. He treated her as an equal, valuing her observations and respecting her abilities. In the evenings around the campfire, their conversations grew deeper, touching on hopes and disappointments, beliefs and doubts. One night, as they camped beneath a vast canopy of stars, Samuel asked, "Do you ever think about what your life might look like a year from now? 5 years?" Darcy stirred the coffee in her tin cup, considering the question. "Before Talon died, I had it all planned out. We were going to head west to California, start fresh where no one knew us or cared about our different backgrounds. And now, Darcy sighed. Now I can barely see past reaching Denver. Everything beyond that is fog." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Grief has a way of shrinking your vision to just the next step, but someday the fog will lift." "Has it lifted for you?" Darcy asked. "After your sister?" "Mostly," Samuel admitted, "though there are still days when the guilt catches me by surprise. Days I wonder if I could have done more to help her." "What would you have done differently?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I would have stood up to my father sooner, would have helped Alina and Diego leave together before my father sent her away." His voice grew soft. "I was 19, thought I had plenty of time to fix things. By the time I acted, it was too late." Darcy reached across the space between them, hesitating only briefly before placing her hand over his. "You were young. So were you when you lost Talon," Samuel pointed out. "Doesn't make the pain any less." "No," Darcy agreed. "But maybe it gives us a chance to learn from it, to do better next time." Samuel turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Is that what you're hoping for, a next time?" Darcy's breath caught at the question and the warmth of his hand against hers. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "For months after Talon died, the idea seemed impossible, disloyal even. And now," Samuel's voice was gentle, his eyes steady on hers across the fire. "Now." Darcy hesitated, suddenly aware of how much had changed since she'd left Val Verde. "Now I think perhaps Talon would want me to find happiness again. He was never one to hold grudges or cling to the past." Samuel's thumb traced a small circle against her palm, sending an unexpected shiver up her arm. "What did he love most about you?" The question surprised her, but Darcy found herself smiling at the memory. "He said I saw the world as it could be, not just as it was. That I dreamed without being afraid of the dreaming." "Wise man," Samuel murmured. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, their hands still joined, until Darcy reluctantly withdrew hers to bank the fire for the night. Something had shifted between them, something delicate and new that neither was quite ready to name. The next day brought them to the edge of a small settlement, little more than a trading post, a saloon, and a handful of rough cabins clustered around a crossroads. They needed supplies, but Darcy felt a familiar tension as they approached, conscious of the curious gazes that followed a woman in riding clothes. "Stay close," Samuel said quietly as they dismounted in front of the trading post. "This doesn't look like the friendliest place." The interior of the trading post was dimly lit and cluttered with goods ranging from tools and ammunition to basic foodstuffs. The proprietor, a heavyset man with a badly healed scar across one cheek, eyed them suspiciously. "What can I do for you folks?" he asked, his gaze lingering on Darcy in a way that made her skin crawl. "Just passing through," Samuel replied easily, though Darcy noted how he positioned himself slightly in front of her. "Need to replenish some supplies before we continue on." They selected what they needed efficiently: coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition for their revolvers. As Samuel paid, the door opened behind them, admitting 3 rough-looking men who fell silent when they spotted Darcy. "Well now, what have we here?" The tallest of the 3 said, his voice slurred with drink despite the early hour. "Don't often see a pretty lady in these parts." Darcy stiffened but kept her expression neutral, continuing to organize their purchases. "My sister and I are just passing through," Samuel said, his tone pleasant but with an undercurrent of steel. "Heading north to join family." The man smirked, clearly disbelieving. "Sister, is it? Funny, you don't look much alike." "Different mothers," Samuel replied without missing a beat. "Now if you'll excuse us, we'd like to be on our way." He gathered their supplies, nodding to Darcy to precede him out the door. She could feel the men's gazes following them as they loaded their purchases onto the horses. "Let's move on," Samuel murmured. I don't like the feel of this place. Darcy nodded, swinging up into her saddle. As they turned to leave, the three men emerged from the trading post, the tall one calling out, "Hold up there." Samuel halted, turning in his saddle. His posture was relaxed, but Darcy noticed his right hand rested near his revolver. Something else. He asked calmly, "Just wondering if your sister might care to stay and brighten up our little town for a while," the man said with a leering grin. "We could make it worth her while." Darcy's hand moved to her own weapon, but Samuel shook his head slightly, warning her to wait. "I appreciate the hospitality," Samuel replied, his voice still even, "but we've got a long journey ahead. Best we be on our way." "Didn't say you were invited to stay," the man retorted, his hand dropping to his own gun. "Just the lady." The tension ratcheted up instantly. Darcy felt her heart pounding as the standoff stretched between them, the tall man's companions spreading out slightly, their intentions clear. "I'm going to say this once," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "The lady is under my protection. We're riding out now, and anyone who tries to stop us will regret it." There was something in his tone, an absolute certainty that made even the drunk men hesitate. The leader's eyes narrowed as he reassessed Samuel, taking in the weathered clothing, the worn holster that spoke of regular use, and the steady hand that hadn't yet drawn but promised swift action if needed. "You willing to die over a woman?" he challenged. "Are you?" Samuel countered. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, surprisingly, the tall man laughed and stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Hell, can't blame a man for trying. Ride on, stranger, but watch your back in these parts." Samuel nodded once, sharp and definitive, before clicking to his horse. They rode out at a measured pace, neither looking back nor spurring to a gallop that might be interpreted as fear. Only when the settlement had disappeared behind them did they allow their horses to pick up speed. "That was too close," Darcy said when they finally stopped to rest several miles later. Samuel nodded, his expression grim. "The frontier brings out the worst in some men. Far from civilization, they forget what it means to be civilized." Darcy studied him, seeing beyond the calm exterior to the tension still evident in the set of his shoulders. "You've handled situations like that before." "More than I care to remember," Samuel confirmed. "Cattle drives attract trouble like honey attracts flies. You learn to diffuse what you can and prepare for what you can't." "Would you have shot them?" Darcy asked quietly. Samuel met her eyes directly. "If they'd tried to harm you, without hesitation, but I'd rather avoid bloodshed when possible. Too many men out here are too quick to reach for their guns." His words reminded her painfully of Talon's fate, killed by a man who shot first and questioned later. The parallel must have shown in her expression, because Samuel's face softened. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was thoughtless of me." Darcy shook her head. "No, you're right. Violence begets violence. Talon used to say the same thing." She managed a small smile. "He would have liked you, I think. You both see beyond the surface of things." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "That's quite a compliment coming from you." Their journey continued northward, the landscape gradually changing as they approached the border between Indian Territory and Kansas. The endless prairie began to give way to more varied terrain, rolling hills, scattered woodlands, and broader rivers requiring careful fording. As they traveled, Darcy found herself watching Samuel with growing awareness. The easy competence with which he handled every challenge of the trail, the quiet consideration he showed for her comfort without being patronizing, the unexpected flashes of humor that lightened difficult moments, all combined to create an increasingly compelling picture. One evening, as a spectacular sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel caught her watching him as he tended the fire. His eyebrow raised in silent question. Darcy felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but didn't look away. "I was just thinking that I'm grateful fate put you in Val Verde the day I was banished." Samuel smiled, the firelight casting warm shadows across his features. "I'd say it was more than fate, maybe providence. You believe in that, a guiding hand in our lives." "I believe there are too many coincidences in this world to be purely chance," Samuel replied. "What are the odds that I'd be passing through that particular town on that exact day, at that exact moment? That I'd witness your courage and be in a position to offer help. Darcy considered this. When you put it that way, it does seem arranged. Does that trouble you? Samuel asked. The idea that our meeting might have been meant to happen, I'm not sure, Darcy admitted. After Talon, I struggled with why things happened as they did, what purpose his death served, if any. Whether loving him was worth the pain that followed. And what did you conclude? Darcy's fingers found the beaded necklace she still wore beneath her blouse. That love is always worth the risk. That Talon changed me for the better, even though our time together was brief. And that perhaps the meaning of his life, of any life, is found in the connections we make with others. Samuel's eyes held hers across the fire. A wise conclusion. Not wisdom so much as survival, Darcy replied softly, finding a way to make sense of senseless loss. That takes its own kind of courage, Samuel observed. Many people never manage it. They let bitterness take root instead. Like the people of Val Verde, Darcy said with a trace of her old anger. Like them, Samuel agreed. Afraid of what they don't understand, clinging to boundaries that make them feel safe, never realizing how much richer life could be if they opened themselves to different perspectives. Darcy studied him with newfound appreciation. You're an unusual man, Samuel Ryder. His smile held a hint of mischief. Is that a compliment or an observation? Both, Darcy replied, returning his smile. Definitely both. That night, as she lay in her bedroll gazing up at the star-strewn sky, Darcy acknowledged to herself what she'd been avoiding for days. She was developing feelings for Samuel that went beyond gratitude or friendship. The realization brought both exhilaration and guilt. Was it disloyal to Talon's memory to feel this way about another man so soon? Yet as she drifted toward sleep, Darcy remembered Talon's words during their last night together. Love isn't a finite resource, Darcy. It multiplies with use. Promise me that whatever happens, you'll keep your heart open. She'd made that promise, never imagining the circumstances under which she would need to keep it. Now, with the steady sound of Samuel's breathing nearby, she wondered if perhaps this too had been part of some larger design, not to replace what she had lost, but to build something new from the ashes of the old. The next day brought them to the Kansas border, marked by nothing more than a weathered sign beside the trail. As they crossed this invisible boundary, Darcy felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They were leaving behind the territory where Talon had died, moving into landscapes he had never seen. You look different today, Samuel observed as they stopped to rest the horses near a small stream. More at peace, Darcy smiled, surprised by his perception. I feel lighter, like I've set down a burden I didn't realize I was carrying. Samuel nodded, understanding. Sometimes a physical journey mirrors an internal one. New territories outside, new territories within. When did you become so philosophical, Cowboy? Darcy teased, the lightness in her spirit finding expression in playfulness she hadn't felt in months. Samuel's eyes crinkled with amusement. Long nights under the stars give a man time to think. That, and a grandfather who believed education didn't stop with schoolbooks. Tell me about him, Darcy invited, genuinely curious about the influences that had shaped this unusual man. As they continued riding, Samuel shared stories of his grandfather, a Scots immigrant who had fought in the Mexican-American War, then settled in Missouri with a trunk full of books and unconventional ideas about equality and justice. He described summers spent on the old man's farm, learning to track and hunt, but also to question accepted wisdom and think for himself. He used to say that a closed mind is like a closed fist, it can't receive gifts, Samuel recalled. He'd have admired your courage in Val Verde, standing up for what you believed despite the consequences. I wish I'd known him, Darcy said softly. So do I, Samuel replied, a shadow of old grief passing across his features. He died while I was away on my first cattle drive. I never got to say goodbye. Impulsively, Darcy reached across the space between their horses, placing her hand on his arm. I'm sorry. Samuel covered her hand with his own, the simple touch conveying more than words. They rode on in companionable silence, the contact between them lingering in Darcy's awareness long after they had separated to navigate a narrow section of trail. That night, Camped in a sheltered hollow with the horses grazing peacefully nearby, Samuel surprised her by producing a battered harmonica from his saddlebag. "I didn't know you played," Darcy said, settling back against her saddle as he blew a few experimental notes. "Not very well," Samuel admitted with a self-deprecating smile, "but it passes the time on lonely trails." He began to play a simple, haunting melody that Darcy recognized as an old folk song her mother used to sing. The sound drifted through the night air, somehow both melancholy and hopeful. When he finished, the silence seemed deeper, more profound. "That was beautiful," Darcy said softly. "Music speaks when words fail," Samuel replied, turning the harmonica in his hands. "My grandfather taught me that too." Darcy hesitated, then asked the question that had been growing in her mind. "Samuel, what happens when we reach Denver?" He looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That depends. On what? On whether you've found what you're looking for by then." Darcy's breath caught at the implications of his words. "And if I haven't?" Samuel set the harmonica aside, his gaze steady on hers. "Then perhaps your journey continues. Perhaps we both have more road to travel before we reach our destinations." "And if our destinations aren't the same?" Darcy pressed, needing to understand what he was offering. "Darcy," Samuel said, his voice gentle but direct, "I've come to care for you more than I expected. More than might be wise, given your recent loss and the circumstances that brought us together." Darcy felt her heart quicken at his honesty. "I'm not asking for promises," he continued. "I'm not even asking for decisions. All I'm suggesting is that when we reach Denver, you take the time you need to determine your own path forward. And if that path has room for me in it, I'll be there." The simplicity of his declaration moved her deeply. There was no pressure in his words, no demand, just an open door she could choose to walk through or not. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding that I need time." Samuel nodded, picking up the harmonica again. "Time is something I can give." He began to play another tune, this one lighter, more hopeful. As the melody wound through the night air, Darcy found herself imagining possibilities she hadn't dared consider before, a future not defined by loss and exile, but by new beginnings and chosen paths. It was a fragile vision, too new to articulate even to herself, but she held it carefully in her heart as the music surrounded them. Their journey through Kansas continued steadily, the days growing cooler as they moved northward and the season advanced. Autumn was painting the landscape in rich golds and russets, the prairie grasses waving like a tawny sea in the constant wind. They encountered more travelers, now freight wagons heading south, settlers moving west, cavalry patrols maintaining an uneasy peace in territories still marked by tension between white settlers and native tribes. Samuel handled each encounter with diplomatic ease, his natural authority and straightforward manner deflecting potential problems. Darcy found herself watching him with growing admiration, seeing not just his physical capabilities, but the deeper qualities that defined him: his fairness, his quiet intelligence, his ability to meet people where they were without judgment. In these interactions, she glimpsed what kind of ranch owner he would be, what kind of community leader, what kind of friend, what kind of partner. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Was she ready to consider such possibilities? Would she ever be? As they crossed into Colorado territory, the distant silhouette of mountains appeared on the western horizon, a promise of their approaching destination, and a reminder of the decisions that awaited her in Denver. "First sight of the Rockies," Samuel observed, reining in beside her as they crested a rise. "Impressive, aren't they?" Darcy nodded, taking in the majestic peaks that seemed to float above the plains. "They're beautiful, like something from a dream." "Wait until you see them up close," Samuel said, a hint of pride in his voice. "My ranch sits in their shadow. The sunrise turns them gold, then rose, then blue as the day advances. Never seen anything like it." There was longing in his voice, not just for the place itself, but for the life he'd built there. Darcy realized with sudden clarity that their arrival in Denver would mean his own journey home would be delayed even further. "You must be eager to get back," she said, "to your ranch." Samuel's gaze shifted from the distant mountains to her face. "I am," he acknowledged, "but some detours are worth taking." The warmth in his eyes made Darcy's cheeks flush, and she looked away, flustered by her own reaction. "We should make good water by nightfall," Samuel continued, tactfully changing the subject. "Decent little town with a proper hotel. Might be nice to sleep in a real bed for a change." Darcy nodded agreement, both relieved and disappointed by the shift in conversation. "That sounds wonderful. A bath and a bed that doesn't have rocks underneath it." Good water proved to be exactly as Samuel had described, a small but prosperous settlement that served as a supply point for surrounding ranches. The hotel was clean and respectable, if not luxurious. Samuel secured 2 rooms, insisting on paying for Darcy's despite her protests. "Consider it my contribution to civilized comfort," he said with a smile that brooked no argument. "After weeks on the trail, we both deserve a night without worrying about coyotes or sudden storms." After the luxury of a hot bath, her first since leaving Val Verde, Darcy felt renewed. She had only one dress in her limited baggage, carefully preserved for occasions when they might encounter civilization. Donning it now, she was struck by how different she felt from the woman who had packed it weeks ago. That woman had been running from shame and grief. This one was moving toward what? She wasn't yet sure, but as she made her way downstairs to meet Samuel for dinner in the hotel's small dining room, she felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with the meal ahead. Samuel waited in the lobby, dressed in clean trail clothes, his hair still damp from his own bath. His eyes widened appreciatively as she descended the stairs, and Darcy felt a pleasant warmth bloom in her chest at his evident admiration. "You look lovely," he said simply as she reached him. "Thank you," Darcy replied, suddenly shy. "It feels strange to be back in a dress after so long in riding clothes." "Both suit you," Samuel observed, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "Though I suspect Val Verde would be scandalized by how comfortable you've become in trousers." Darcy laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine mirth. "Val Verde was scandalized by my existence. Might as well give them something real to talk about." Dinner was a pleasant affair, the food simple but well prepared, the dining room quiet enough for conversation. They talked easily, like old friends, though Darcy was intensely aware of the current of attraction that flowed beneath their words. Samuel was attentive without being overbearing, respectful without being distant. As they lingered over coffee, a piano in the adjoining parlor came to life, someone playing a slow waltz that drifted through the open doorway. "Would you care to dance?" Samuel asked, setting down his cup. Darcy hesitated, then nodded, allowing him to lead her into the parlor where several other couples were already moving to the music. The pianist, an elderly gentleman with nimble fingers, nodded acknowledgement as they joined the impromptu gathering. Samuel's hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her into the steps of the waltz. Darcy had learned to dance as part of her upbringing, but it had been years since she'd had occasion to use those skills. To her surprise, Samuel moved with natural grace despite his trail-worn appearance. "You dance well for a cowboy," she observed, falling into rhythm with him. Samuel smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "My grandmother insisted, said no grandson of hers would stomp around like a bull with a burr under its tail." Darcy laughed, the tension she'd felt earlier dissolving in the simple pleasure of movement and music. They danced several numbers, gradually moving closer together as the evening progressed. When the pianist finally announced the last song, a slow, tender melody, Samuel drew her gently into his arms. "Is this all right?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her hair. Darcy nodded, unable to voice the tangle of emotions his nearness evoked. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, her head coming to rest naturally against his shoulder, his cheek brushing the top of her head. The rightness of it struck Darcy with unexpected force this moment, this man, this quiet joy blooming in the midst of what had begun as exile. When the music ended, they remained standing together for a heartbeat longer than necessary, reluctant to break the spell. "Thank you for the dance," Samuel said as they finally stepped apart, "and for the pleasure of your company." "The pleasure was mutual," Darcy replied, her voice not quite steady, They walked together to the foot of the stairs that led to their separate rooms, pausing in a moment of shared uncertainty. "We should reach Denver in 2 more days," Samuel said, his eyes searching hers. "If the weather holds." Darcy nodded, the reminder of their journey's end bringing a sudden ache. "Yes, I suppose we will." "Darcy," Samuel began, then hesitated. "I hope you know that whatever you decide in Denver, whatever path you choose these weeks have meant more to me than I can say." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Acting on impulse, Darcy rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Samuel," she whispered, then turned and hurried up the stairs, her heart pounding as if she'd run for miles. In the privacy of her room, Darcy stood by the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Her fingers touched her lips, still feeling the brief contact with Samuel's skin. It had been a simple gesture, chaste by any standard, yet it felt momentous, a first step across a threshold she hadn't been sure she was ready to cross. Talon's face rose in her memory, not with the sharp pain of recent grief, but with a gentle sadness tinged with gratitude for what they had shared. "Keep your heart open," he had said. Tonight, for the first time, she felt she truly understood what he had meant. The final days of their journey passed too quickly. They left good water behind, following trails that wound steadily northward and westward, drawing closer to Denver with each passing mile. The mountains loomed larger now, their snow-capped peaks dazzling in the autumn sunlight. Between them, a new awareness hummed like a plucked string, neither rushing nor retreating from the connection that had grown between them. Their conversations ranged widely, from books to politics, from dreams to disappointments, each revelation building a bridge of understanding. On what would be their last night on the trail, camped within a day's ride of Denver, Darcy found herself reluctant for sleep to come, knowing it would bring the morning and their arrival in the city. "What will you do after you reach your ranch?" she asked Samuel as they sat beside the fire, the mountains a dark silhouette against the starry sky. "First, check that my foreman hasn't run everything into the ground," Samuel replied with a smile. "Then start planning for winter, making sure there's enough hay stored, cabins weatherproofed, stock in good condition." "It sounds like a full life," Darcy observed. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Full in some ways, empty in others." The implication hung between them, neither needing to articulate it further. "And you?" Samuel asked. "What will you do in Denver, beyond helping your aunt with her shop?" Darcy considered the question. "I'm not sure yet. I've had ideas on the trail, perhaps teaching or writing. I've always loved books, stories. Maybe it's time I created some of my own." "You'd be good at that," Samuel said with genuine warmth. "You see the heart of things, that's rare." "Is it?" Darcy smiled, touched by his faith in her capabilities. "Very," Samuel confirmed. "Most people get caught up in surfaces, appearances, conventions, what others will think. You look deeper. It's what drew me to you from the beginning." Darcy met his gaze across the fire. "What will you do if I decide to stay in Denver, permanently, I mean?" Samuel's expression grew serious. "I'll respect your decision. Visit when I can if you'll allow it. Hope that perhaps in time you might consider other possibilities." "Such as?" Darcy prompted, needing to hear him articulate what had been building between them. Samuel set aside his coffee cup and moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cool night air. "Such as joining me at the ranch," he said quietly. "Not right away, you need time to heal, to find your own footing again, but someday when you're ready, if you ever are." Darcy's heart raced at the honesty of his words. "And if I'm never ready, then I'll have had the privilege of knowing you," Samuel replied simply. "Of traveling with you, learning from you. Some journeys are worth taking even if they don't end where you hoped." Moved beyond words, Darcy reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. They sat in silence as the fire burned low, the future uncertain but full of possibilities neither had imagined when they'd first met in Val Verde. Denver appeared on the horizon the next day, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled at the foot of the mountains. As they approached, Darcy felt a curious mixture of anticipation and regret, the end of one journey, perhaps the beginning of another. Her aunt's shop and attached home were located on a side street not far from the city center. Margaret Ellis, A tall woman with Darcy's same determined chin and intelligent eyes rushed from the shop at their approach, clearly having been watching for their arrival. "Darcy, my dear girl," she exclaimed, embracing her niece as Darcy dismounted. "I've been so worried since receiving your letter. Are you all right?" "I am now," Darcy replied, returning the embrace with genuine affection. "Thanks in no small part to my traveling companion." She turned to introduce Samuel, who had dismounted and stood respectfully nearby, hat in hand. "Aunt Margaret, this is Samuel Ryder. He's been my guide and protector from Val Verde. I wouldn't have made it safely without him." Margaret assessed Samuel with shrewd eyes before extending her hand. "Then it seems I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Ryder. Please, both of you come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity, baths arranged, fresh clothes provided, a substantial meal prepared. Darcy recounted a condensed version of events in Val Verde, touched by her aunt's indignation on her behalf and complete lack of judgment regarding Talon. "Narrow-minded fools," Margaret declared. "As if love could be confined by their petty rules and prejudices. Your mother always did care too much about appearances." By evening, Darcy was settled in a comfortable room in her aunt's home, surrounded by more comforts than she'd known in weeks. Samuel had been offered accommodations as well, at least for the night before he continued to his ranch. After dinner, Margaret tactfully retired early, leaving Darcy and Samuel alone in the small parlor. The uncertainty that had hovered between them on the trail seemed magnified now, in this civilized setting so different from their shared campfires. "Your aunt is a remarkable woman," Samuel observed, breaking the awkward silence. Darcy smiled. "She is. Strong, independent, unafraid to live by her own principles. I've always admired her, though I never expected to follow in her footsteps quite so literally." "She clearly adores you," Samuel said. "You'll be in good hands here." "Yes," Darcy agreed, hearing the note of finality in his voice. "You'll leave tomorrow," Samuel nodded. "I should. Winter comes early in the mountains. There's much to do before the first snows." Another silence fell between them, heavier than before. "Samuel," Darcy began, gathering her courage. "These past weeks have been a gift," he finished for her. "One I hadn't expected and won't forget." "Nor will I," Darcy said softly. "I'm not ready to make decisions about the future, not yet. But I want you to know that what's grown between us means a great deal to me." Samuel's eyes warmed with understanding. "There's no rush, Darcy. Take the time you need. Denver isn't so far from Durango that visits would be impossible." "I'd like that," Darcy replied, relief flooding through her. "Very much. So would I." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Whatever comes next, I'm grateful our paths crossed in Val Verde. Some might call it chance, I call it providence." Darcy smiled, remembering their conversation under the stars. "Perhaps they're two sides of the same coin. Chance for those who aren't looking, providence for those who are." "Philosophical as well as beautiful," Samuel observed, his smile reaching his eyes. "Yet another reason I find it hard to say goodbye." "Then don't," Darcy suggested impulsively. "Say until we meet again instead." Samuel's smile deepened as he raised her hand to his lips. "Until we meet again, Darcy Ellis." The touch of his lips against her skin sent a pleasant shiver through her, a promise of possibilities yet to be explored. The following morning brought Samuel's departure, his horse rested and provisioned for the journey to Durango. Darcy and her aunt stood on the porch as he made his final preparations, securing his saddlebags and checking the cinch one last time. "He's a good man," Margaret observed quietly. "Not many would have done what he did, escorting a stranger across dangerous territory with no guarantee of reward." "I know," Darcy replied, watching as Samuel patted his horse's neck. "And he cares for you," her aunt continued. "That much is obvious even to my old eyes." Darcy glanced at her aunt, finding only warmth and understanding in her expression. "It's too soon," she said softly. "After Talon, the heart has its own timetable," Margaret interrupted gently. "Neither too fast nor too slow, but exactly as it should be. Don't let fear of what others might think or even fear of your own feelings keep you from happiness when it presents itself." Darcy considered her aunt's words as Samuel approached to make his farewells. There was so much she wanted to say, yet the moment called for simplicity, not complexity. Safe travels, she said, extending her hand. Samuel took it, his eyes holding hers. Thank you for allowing me to accompany you. It's been an honor. The honor was mine, Darcy replied, meaning it deeply. They stood for a moment, hands clasped, neither quite ready to let go. Then Samuel released her hand and turned to Margaret. Madam, thank you for your hospitality. It's been a pleasure meeting you. Margaret smiled warmly. The pleasure was mine, Mr. Ryder, and remember, our door is always open should you find yourself in Denver again. Samuel nodded, then turned back to Darcy one last time. Until we meet again, he said softly. Until then, she echoed. She watched as he mounted and rode away, his straight figure gradually diminishing with distance until he turned a corner and disappeared from view. Only then did she realize she was clutching the beaded necklace beneath her dress, Talon's gift, once a talisman of grief, now transformed into something else. A reminder that love, once experienced, never truly leaves us, but becomes part of who we are and who we might yet become. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm of their own. Darcy settled into life with her aunt, helping in the dressmaking shop and gradually expanding her circle of acquaintances in Denver. Margaret introduced her to friends who shared their progressive views, people who accepted Darcy's past without judgment and appreciated her quick intelligence and warm heart. Samuel's first letter arrived a month after his departure, a detailed account of his journey to Durango and the condition in which he'd found his ranch. His foreman, a capable young man named Thomas, had kept things running smoothly in his absence. The autumn cattle sale had gone well, providing funds for the improvements Samuel had planned. Darcy read the letter repeatedly, hearing his voice in every carefully chosen word. She responded with equal care, sharing her own experiences in Denver, her growing involvement in her aunt's business, and the tentative plans she was forming to perhaps teach at the small school that had recently opened nearby. Their correspondence continued through the winter months, letters traveling between Denver and Durango whenever the mountain passes allowed. Each exchange deepened their connection, allowing them to share thoughts and feelings with a freedom sometimes easier on paper than in person. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of easier travel, Darcy found herself watching the calendar with growing anticipation. Samuel had mentioned in his last letter that he hoped to visit Denver once the heaviest snows melted, perhaps in early April. "You're restless," Margaret observed one evening as they sat by the fire, Darcy's needlework lying neglected in her lap as she stared into the flames. "Thinking of your cowboy?" Darcy smiled at her aunt's perceptiveness. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who knows the signs," Margaret replied with a knowing smile. "I was young once too, you know." "Did you ever regret not remarrying after Uncle James died?" Darcy asked, curious about the choices that had shaped her aunt's independent life. Margaret considered the question seriously. Sometimes, there were moments of loneliness that might have been easier with a partner, but I valued my freedom too much to settle for the kind of marriage most men of my generation expected. She studied her niece with affection. "You, however, might be fortunate enough to find a man who doesn't demand settlement." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Margaret said gently, "that your Mr. Ryder strikes me as the rare sort who values strength in a woman rather than fearing it. The sort who would stand beside you rather than expect you to walk behind him." Darcy felt a warm glow at her aunt's assessment, which matched her own growing feelings. "He is rare," she acknowledged. "Patient, too. He's never pressed me for promises I'm not ready to make." "Patience is an undervalued virtue," Margaret observed, "especially in matters of the heart." April arrived with warming temperatures and the first green shoots of spring pushing through the soil. Samuel's letter announcing his imminent visit sent Darcy into a flurry of anticipation, both excited and nervous to see him again after months apart. He arrived on a clear morning, the mountains behind Denver still capped with winter snow but the city itself embracing spring. Darcy spotted him from the shop window as he approached on horseback, his familiar figure causing her heart to leap in her chest. "Go," Margaret urged with a knowing smile when she saw Darcy's expression. "I can manage things here." Darcy needed no further encouragement, untying her apron and hurrying to the door. Samuel was just dismounting as she emerged, his face breaking into a broad smile at the sight of her. "Darcy," he said, his voice warm with pleasure. "Samuel," she replied, suddenly shy despite the months of correspondence that had passed between them. He approached slowly, as if giving her time to adjust to his presence. "You look well," he observed, taking in her healthy color and the new confidence in her bearing. "Denver agrees with you." "It does," Darcy acknowledged, "and Durango seems to agree with you. You look." She hesitated, then finished honestly, "Wonderful." Samuel's smile deepened at her candor. "I've missed you," he said simply. "I've missed you too," Darcy replied, surprising herself with how easily the admission came. Margaret emerged from the shop then, breaking the moment with her warm greeting and practical questions about Samuel's journey. As they moved inside for refreshments, Darcy caught Samuel watching her, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she felt in her own heart. Samuel stayed in Denver for a week, taking a room at a nearby hotel but spending most of his days with Darcy and her aunt. He accompanied them to social gatherings, attended church services, and joined Darcy for long walks through the growing city. Each day revealed new facets of compatibility between them, strengthening the connection that had begun on the trail from Val Verde. On his last evening in Denver, Samuel invited Darcy to dinner at the finest restaurant in the city. She wore her best dress, a deep blue creation her aunt had helped her make, her hair arranged in an elegant style that suited the occasion. "You take my breath away," Samuel said when she appeared, his admiration evident in his gaze. The restaurant was elegant without being ostentatious, the food excellent, the service discreet. As they dined, Darcy found herself studying Samuel across the table, struck by how right it felt to be with him in this setting, as if they'd shared such moments 100 times before. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her thoughtful gaze. "That I'm very glad you happened to be in Val Verde that day," Darcy replied honestly. "Even with all that came before, all the pain and loss, I can't regret the path that led me here to this moment." Samuel reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Nor can I. Though I wish you had been spared the suffering that brought you to that crossroads." Darcy turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Without that suffering, I might never have left Val Verde, might never have known what it is to forge my own path, might never have met you." "A high price for such knowledge," Samuel observed. "Perhaps," Darcy agreed, "but life rarely offers its most valuable lessons cheaply." Samuel's expression grew serious. "Darcy, I've been patient because I respect your need for time, for space to heal. But before I leave tomorrow, I need to be clear about my feelings, about my hopes." Darcy's heart quickened, but she nodded encouragement, ready to hear what he would say. "I love you," Samuel said simply, his directness taking her breath away. "I think I began falling in love with you that first day in Val Verde, when you stood alone against the entire town. Every day since has only deepened that feeling." Darcy felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by his honesty. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," Samuel continued. "I'm not even asking for a promise. I'm just letting you know where I stand, where my heart is." Darcy squeezed his hand, finding her voice despite the emotion welling up within her. "Samuel, she paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I feel for you has grown so gradually, so naturally, that I can hardly mark its beginning, but it's real and it's deep and it's—" She took a breath. "It's love, I think, different from what I felt for Talon, but no less true for being different." The joy that bloomed on Samuel's face at her words made her heart swell with answering happiness. "Different is as it should be," he said gently. "Each love has its own character, its own purpose. I would never want to replace what you shared with him, only to build something new alongside those memories." Darcy nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I know. That's one of the many things I love about you." They sat in silence for a moment, both absorbing the significance of the declarations they had just made. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice soft but steady. "I'll be returning to Durango tomorrow. My ranch needs me, especially with spring planting and the new cattle arriving." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "But I'd like to come back in a month's time if you're amenable, and perhaps if you're willing, you might consider visiting Durango afterward, to see if it's a place you could imagine. Imagine making a home, Darcy finished for him when he hesitated. Samuel nodded, his expression hopeful but not presumptuous. Yes, with me, Darcy considered his words the future they suggested. 6 months ago, the idea would have terrified her. Now it filled her with a quiet excitement. I would like that, she said softly. Both your return visit and a journey to Durango. I think it's time I saw this ranch you speak of so lovingly. The smile that lit Samuel's face was worth any uncertainty the future might hold. As they finished their meal and walked back through the spring evening to her aunt's home, Darcy felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place in a pattern more beautiful than she could have imagined during those dark days in Val Verde. At her door, Samuel took both her hands in his eyes reflecting the starlight above. Until next month, then. Until then, Darcy confirmed. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Darcy met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. It was brief, gentle, perfect for this moment of new beginnings. "Good night, Darcy Ellis," Samuel whispered as they parted. "Good night, Samuel Ryder," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her heart. She watched him walk away, not with the ache of loss she had felt in Denver months before, but with the warm certainty that he would return. That this parting was not an ending but a pause in a story still unfolding. Inside, Margaret waited in the parlor, her knowing smile indicating she had witnessed their farewell from the window. "I take it Mr. Ryder made his intentions clear," Darcy nodded, unable to suppress her own smile. "He did, and I told him I love him." Margaret's eyes filled with genuine pleasure. "I'm so happy for you, my dear. You deserve this chance at joy." "I've been invited to visit his ranch," Darcy added, "to see if I could imagine a life there." "And can you?" her aunt asked. "Imagine it, I mean." Darcy considered the question seriously. "I think so. Not immediately, perhaps. There's still healing to be done, still parts of myself to reclaim, but eventually, yes." She smiled, a new confidence in her expression. "I've discovered I'm rather good at building a life from unexpected beginnings." "That you are," Margaret agreed proudly. "That you most certainly are." The month until Samuel's return passed quickly, filled with preparations for Darcy's potential visit to Durango. She continued working in her aunt's shop, but also began teaching reading 3 afternoons a week at the local school, discovering a natural talent for education that brought her great satisfaction. Samuel's letters arrived regularly, filled with details about spring on the ranch, new calves being born, fields being planted, improvements to the main house being completed. Reading between the lines, Darcy could sense his growing excitement about her visit, his hope that she might find Durango as appealing as he did. When he returned to Denver in mid-May, the change in their relationship was evident from the moment he arrived. Gone was the hesitation, the careful distance they had maintained before. In its place was a comfortable intimacy, a natural gravitation toward each other that spoke of decisions already made in their hearts if not yet formalized in words. They spent the week exploring Denver together, planning for Darcy's journey to Durango and sharing their hopes for the future. On Samuel's last evening in the city, they walked together in a small park near Margaret's home, the air sweet with the scent of new blossoms. "I've been thinking," Samuel said as they paused by a flowering cherry tree. "About timing. What about it?" Darcy asked, curious about his serious tone. "I'll return to Durango tomorrow. You're planning to visit in 3 weeks' time." He turned to face her fully. If you find you could be happy there with me, would you consider not returning to Denver immediately? Would you consider staying?" Darcy's breath caught at the implication. "You mean?" "I mean as my wife," Samuel clarified, his voice steady though his eyes revealed his vulnerability. "I know it's soon. I know there are many reasons to wait, but I also know, with a certainty I've never felt before, that you are the woman I want to share my life with." Darcy's heart raced as she considered his words. It was soon less than a year since Talon's death, less than a year since her banishment from Val Verde. Yet in that time, she had traveled not just physically, but emotionally, from grief to healing, from exile to homecoming in the truest sense. "If I say yes," she began carefully, It would need to be a true partnership. I've discovered strengths in myself I never knew existed. I can't go back to being the dutiful daughter Val Verde expected me to be." "I would never ask that of you," Samuel replied with feeling. "What drew me to you from the beginning was your spirit, your courage, your willingness to stand for what you believe. I don't want a submissive wife. I want a partner who challenges me, who grows with me." His words resonated deeply with Darcy's own desires. "And my teaching, my writing." "The ranch needs a school," Samuel said simply, "and I can think of no better teacher. As for your writing, there are stories that need telling, perspectives that need sharing. I would be proud to support you in both endeavors." Darcy studied him in the fading light, this man who had entered her life at its darkest moment and helped her find her way back to joy. Who had given her time to heal without pressure, who had loved her enough to let her find her own path even if it might not have led to him. "Yes," she said, the word feeling right on her lips. "If Durango feels like it could be home, then yes, Samuel Ryder, I will stay. I will be your wife." The joy that transformed his features was answer enough, but he pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "I promise you won't regret it," he whispered against her hair. "I know I won't," Darcy replied, lifting her face to his. Their kiss sealed the promise between them, a beginning rather than an ending, a doorway opening to possibilities neither could fully imagine but both were eager to explore. The journey to Durango 3 weeks later felt different from their original trek from Val Verde. This time, Darcy rode not as an exile but as a woman making a choice, claiming a future of her own design. Margaret had embraced her decision with genuine happiness, extracting only a promise of regular visits and assurance that the wedding would take place in Denver where she could attend. Samuel met her at the halfway point, his face alight with pleasure at her arrival. They traveled the remaining distance together, his pride in the land growing more evident as they approached Durango and the valley he called home. The first sight of his ranch took Darcy's breath away. Nestled at the foot of majestic mountains, with the Animas River winding through lush pastureland, it was even more beautiful than Samuel had described. The main house, recently expanded, stood on a gentle rise overlooking the property, with a barn and outbuildings nearby. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and a small grove of aspen trees shimmered silver green in the afternoon light. "Welcome home," Samuel said softly as they reined in their horses at the top of the final hill. "If you want it to be." Darcy took in the scene before her, feeling a sense of rightness settle deep in her bones. "It's beautiful," she said simply, "even more than I imagined." As they rode down to the house, several people emerged to greet them. Thomas, the foreman Samuel had mentioned, Maria, the woman who cooked and kept house, and a few of the ranch hands, curious to meet the woman their boss had spoken of with such admiration. Their welcome was warm and genuine, making Darcy feel immediately at ease. The house itself, when Samuel showed her through it, proved to be comfortable without being pretentious solid furniture, large windows to capture the spectacular views, bookshelves already filled with volumes Samuel had mentioned knowing she would enjoy. "I had the study prepared for you," he said, showing her a sunny room with a desk positioned to overlook the mountains. "For your writing, and there's space behind the foreman's house that would be perfect for a schoolroom when you're ready." Touched by his thoughtfulness, by how carefully he had considered her needs and desires, Darcy turned to him with tears in her eyes. "You've thought of everything." "I've tried," Samuel admitted. "I want you to be happy here, Darcy. I want this to feel like your home as much as it is mine." Darcy moved to the window, gazing out at the land that stretched before her, not the confining boundaries of Val Verde, with its rigid expectations and narrow minds, but open space, room to grow, to create, to become. "It already does," she said softly, turning back to him. "Feel like home." The joy in Samuel's eyes matched the feeling in her own heart, a sense of completion, of journey's end and beginning all at once. The weeks that followed confirmed Darcy's initial impression. She settled into life on the ranch with surprising ease, learning its rhythms and routines, getting to know the people who worked there, exploring the surrounding countryside on horseback. Samuel was attentive without being hovering, giving her space to find her own place in this new world while clearly delighting in her presence. Word was sent to Margaret that the wedding would indeed take place in Denver, as promised, with a date set for early August. Preparations began by correspondence, Margaret handling many of the details from her end, while Darcy focused on creating a life for herself in Durango. She began by organizing a small school for the children of the ranch workers and neighboring homesteads, teaching 3 days a week in the converted space behind the foreman's house. The work brought her immense satisfaction, as did the evenings spent writing at the desk in her study, putting into words the experiences and insights she had gained through her own journey. Samuel, true to his word, supported both endeavors wholeheartedly, taking pride in her accomplishments and encouraging her to pursue her own interests alongside their shared life. Their partnership deepened with each passing day, built on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that continued to grow in richness and complexity. As the wedding approached, Darcy found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led her to this point. The town that had banished her for loving wrongly had unwittingly set her on a journey to a fuller, freer life than she could have imagined within its confining boundaries. The grief that had nearly broken her had taught her the strength of her own heart, its capacity not just for sorrow but for joy, for growth, for new beginnings. August arrived with golden sunshine and fields ablaze with wildflowers. Darcy and Samuel made the journey to Denver together, arriving several days before the wedding to finalize preparations with Margaret, who had outdone herself in organizing a celebration that would honor their love without unnecessary ostentation. The night before the ceremony, Darcy sat with her aunt in the parlor where she had begun her new life nearly a year before. Margaret, ever perceptive, studied her niece with knowing eyes. "You've come a long way from the heartbroken young woman who arrived at my door last autumn," she observed. Darcy smiled, acknowledging the truth of her aunt's words. "I have, though I wouldn't have believed it possible then." "Are you happy, truly happy?" Margaret asked, the question simple but profound. "Yes," Darcy replied without hesitation. "Not because Samuel rescued me or fixed what was broken. He didn't. He simply walked beside me while I found my own way forward. That's the gift he gave me, space to heal, to grow, to discover who I could become after Val Verde." Margaret nodded, satisfaction in her expression. "That's how I know this marriage will succeed where so many fail. It's built not on dependency but on choice, on two whole people choosing to join their lives, not out of need but out of desire to share what they've already built separately." Darcy leaned forward, embracing her aunt with deep affection. "Thank you for showing me it was possible. For being an example of a woman who chose her own path." Margaret returned the embrace, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become, Darcy. Your mother and father were fools to let you go." The wedding took place the following day in the garden behind Margaret's home, transformed for the occasion with flowers and ribbons. Darcy wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with Talon's beaded necklace tucked beneath the bodice, a private acknowledgement of the journey that had led her here, the love that had shaped her even in its loss. Samuel waited for her beneath an arch of roses, his face lighting with wonder as she approached on Margaret's arm. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows written by themselves to reflect the partnership they envisioned, built on equality, respect, and a love that allowed each to grow while growing together. "I take you not as my possession, but as my companion," Samuel promised, his voice steady and clear. "I pledge to walk beside you, not ahead or behind, through whatever joys or sorrows life brings, to respect your mind, your heart, your spirit as gifts to be cherished, not controlled." Darcy, her eyes bright with unshed tears, responded in kind. "I choose you freely, with clear eyes and an open heart. I promise to be your partner in all things, to stand with you in times of hardship, to celebrate with you in times of joy. To build with you a life of purpose, of meaning, of love that grows deeper with each passing day." As they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, Darcy felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with conforming to social expectations and everything to do with finding her own path to happiness. The journey that had begun in exile had led her not just to a new place, but to a new understanding of herself, of love, of possibility. The celebration that followed was joyful but intimate, attended by friends Margaret had introduced them to in Denver, and a few who had traveled from Durango to witness the union of two people who had found in each other not just love but true partnership. As evening fell and lanterns were lit in the garden, Samuel drew Darcy aside for a moment of privacy amid the festivities. "Happy?" he asked softly, his hands warm around hers. "More than I knew was possible," Darcy replied honestly. "And you?" "Completely," Samuel assured her, his eyes reflecting the depth of his feeling. "Though I have a confession to make." Darcy raised an eyebrow, curious. "What sort of confession?" Samuel's expression turned slightly sheepish. "That day in Val Verde when I said I happened to be passing through. It wasn't entirely accurate." "Oh, I'd heard about the town's reaction to your relationship with Talon," Samuel explained. "News travels fast on the frontier, especially news of controversy. I was curious, I suppose, about the woman who had defied an entire town for love. I deliberately changed my route to pass through Val Verde." Darcy's eyes widened in surprise. "You came because of me, before you even knew me," Samuel nodded, a rueful smile playing at his lips. "I told myself it was just curiosity. But when I saw you standing before that town council, head high despite their condemnation." He shook his head slightly, wonder in his voice. "I knew then I wanted to know you, to understand what gave you such courage." "And now?" Darcy asked, moved by his revelation. "Having known me these many months." "Now," Samuel said softly, drawing her closer, "I understand that courage is only one of your many qualities worth admiring, and I thank whatever providence led me to that dusty town on that particular day." As he lowered his lips to hers, sealing his words with a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, Darcy silently offered her own thanks for the journey that had begun in loss and led to such unexpected joy, for the love that had taught her the strength of her own heart, and for the man who had recognized that strength when others had seen only defiance. In the years that followed, the ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. The school Darcy had begun grew to serve children from throughout the valley, earning a reputation for progressive education that attracted families seeking more than the basic curriculum offered elsewhere. Her writing, initially a private pursuit, gradually found its way to publication first in local newspapers, then in magazines with wider circulation. Samuel's prediction about the school proved accurate, as did his support for her literary endeavors. Their partnership flourished both personally and professionally, each contributing their strengths to build not just a successful ranch, but a home known for its warmth and hospitality. 2 years after their wedding, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Margaret's late husband. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elena, named in honor of Samuel's sister, whose fate had shaped his understanding of love and choice. Margaret visited regularly, delighting in her role as great aunt and bringing news from Denver. On one such visit, when James was 5 and Elena 3, she brought an unexpected piece of correspondence, a letter from Darcy's mother, her first communication since the banishment from Val Verde. The letter was awkward, hesitant, clearly written by a woman struggling to reconcile long-held beliefs with the painful reality of estrangement from her only child. She spoke of changes in Val Verde, the arrival of the railroad, the gradual diversification of the population, the slow but perceptible softening of some of the town's harsher attitudes. Most significantly, she expressed regret. Not a full apology, not yet, but an acknowledgement that perhaps, in their rigid adherence to community standards, she and Darcy's father had lost something more valuable than social standing. Darcy read the letter multiple times, her emotions complicated. The young woman who had been banished from Val Verde might have responded with righteous anger or bitter rejection. The woman she had become, wife, mother, teacher, writer, mistress of her own fate, could afford a more nuanced response. "What will you do?" Samuel asked that evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and crimson. Darcy considered the question carefully. "I'll write back," she said finally. Not to reopen old wounds or to absolve them of responsibility, but to share who I've become despite or perhaps because of what happened. Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. And if they want more, to visit perhaps. Then we'll consider it, Darcy replied, her gaze taking in their children playing nearby under Margaret's watchful eye. Not for my sake, but for James and Alina. They deserve to know their heritage, all of it, the good and the bad, the courage and the fear. Samuel reached for her hand, his touch as reassuring as it had been that first night on the trail from Val Verde. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Darcy squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for the partnership they had built. I know. That's what gives me the strength to consider reconciliation, knowing that my worth no longer depends on their approval. That I've found my own way, my own family, my own home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a final blaze of glory before surrendering to the coming night, Darcy reflected on the journey that had led her here. From the dust of Val Verde to the verdant valley of her new home, from the pain of rejection to the joy of acceptance, from loving too deeply to finding a love that matched her own capacity for depth and growth. The path had not been straight or easy, but it had been true. And in the end, that was what mattered most, not that she had been banished for loving deeply, but that she had found in Samuel Ryder the kind of love that made such courage worthwhile. A love that honored rather than feared her strength, that celebrated rather than contained her spirit, that had helped her transform exile into the greatest journey of her life. No regrets, Samuel asked softly, seeming to follow her thoughts. Darcy smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as their children's laughter filled the gathering dusk. Not one, she replied, not a single one.